Hello and welcome. Great to see all of you here today. I want to begin by recognizing that the University of Maine at Farmington occupies the traditional homelands of the Abenaki people of Amiskanti, whose communities lived and sustained themselves along what we call the Sandy River for millennia until very recent times. We acknowledge that this community was largely displaced to the Wallanock and Odanak reserves in Quebec, Canada as a result of colonial warfare, and that their descendants remain there today. The Abenaki people of Western Maine are the original caretakers of this area and maintain a sacred connection with it. We pledge to honor that relationship by educating ourselves about their history and current struggles, and by investigating our own responsibility to correct ongoing injustice. We wish to extend this acknowledgement to the Maliseet, Micmac, Penobscot, and Passamaquoddy nations who, with the Abenaki of Wallanock and Odanak, make up the Wabanaki people. We recognize and affirm the sovereignty of Native nations in this territory and beyond. We recognize that sovereignty means the ability to self-govern and to govern over one's homelands, and we understand that this statement has real implications, that decolonization is not a metaphor. We pledge to continue our collaboration with the Wabanaki people to further decolonize spaces and transform UMF into a place that honors Wabanaki and other indigenous peoples. We acknowledge that this is an ongoing process in which the University of Maine at Farmington promises to partake in partnership with the many indigenous individuals who have contributed to this important cause. So welcome to our keynote event for the New Commons Project's exploration of the film Get Out, nominated by several folks in the second round. We are really excited to be, hope some of you are able to see the screening or come to some of the other events, particularly Michael Johnson's wonderful faculty talk last week. But if not, I'm sure that you will learn everything that you need to know within the scope of this lecture. We are really thrilled to have with us today for our keynote address Professor Kevin Wynter, who is Assistant Professor of Media at Pomona College. Professor Wynter's research is on history and theory of the moving image and is informed by interdisciplinary training in media and film studies, critical theory, and continental philosophy. He focuses on body genres and contemporary European art cinema, screen histories of race and representation, psychoanalytic theory, and Black popular culture. Significantly for our purposes, he is also the author of a book called Critical Race Theory and Jordan Peele's Get Out. So he's literally written a book about this film. And he's working now on a new book project entitled Feeling Absence, Horror in Cinema from Post-War America to Post-War Europe, post-wall Europe, examining European art cinema from the late 80s to the early 2000s in the context of the themes and motifs of the modern American horror film. So for many reasons, this is truly the perfect person to have as our keynote speaker for the film Get Out, particularly in our examination of it as a horror film, which has been kind of a theme of this unit. And I wanted to mention on that note that next Wednesday, I think this is our final New Commons event for this unit, Aaron Wyansky will be giving a Horror Soundtracks 101 lecture in Emory at 11:45. So we hope that you can join us for that conversation, which will be excellent. For now, though, we are delighted to welcome Professor Kevin Wynter. Please welcome him to UMF.
Thanks so much for having me, and thanks very much to, can everyone hear me? Yeah. Thanks so much to Kristen and Steve for the invitation. The work that you guys are doing with the New Commons Project I think is absolutely fantastic, so I am really excited to be here. You guys are really kind of out here. Like if you were to chart a path from Los Angeles to UMaine Farmington, it's quite a trek, but I'm very, very happy to be here. Okay, so let's get right into it. I'm pleased to be here and to have an opportunity to share with you some of the ideas in my forthcoming book, Critical Race Theory and Jordan Peele's Get Out, which should be out in the spring of next year. And so the title of my talk today is The Final Brother on Horror and Black Survivability. As the title suggests, the focus of this discussion centers on the conventions of the American horror film. What happens to its generic codes when there is a black male protagonist who survives after the monster has been defeated and the credits roll? The subject of black survivability opens up areas of inquiry concerning the cultural dynamics and industrial conditions that work to ingrain the expendability of black life in horror. I want to suggest that when we call attention to the kinds of plot lines, story arcs, and tropes commonly associated with black characters in horror films, the questions that emerge concern not merely black survival, but the conditions under which black survival is possible or even thinkable. And these conditions are set in stark contrast with the possibilities for survival afforded white characters, particularly white protagonists. To help put this discussion into context with the genre as a whole, it is important to note that the modern horror film has historically proven to be a reliable barometer of America's cultural degeneracy and social deterioration. The most popular and influential films of the genre's Gilded Age of the 1970s all appeared against the backdrop of widespread socio-political upheaval and economic uncertainty. When asked to describe what inspired their first horror films, Tobe Hooper, director of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Larry Cohen, director of It's Alive, and Wes Craven, director of The Last House on the Left, collectively cite the unpopularity of the Vietnam War, the erosion of political confidence after Watergate, and eruptions of violence during the Civil Rights Movement as direct influences on their work. Over this period, the stability of the American family was also impacted as men returned from war traumatized, maimed, or were otherwise affected by rising joblessness, a flatlining economy, bogged down by rampant inflation, loss of manufacturing jobs, and other forms of social disenfranchisement. These instabilities find their corollary in the breakages of kinship ties and family bonds in the horror genre. With little exception, every horror film of even partial distinction through the modern period leans on the premise that the domestic home and family unit, or its precursor, the heterosexual couple, is imperiled by a threatening other, or is the locus of the monster's basic instincts. This thematic fusing of familial disintegration and monstrosity is typically expressed through some form of repression, a dark secret, illicit desires, or an inherited wrong from the past that inevitably must return and be confronted. Narratives shaped by the logic of repression have largely defined the horror genre since its inception, but in films after the millennium, one can track a move away from repression, sexual or otherwise, and characters who confront the traumas or transgressions of the past toward plot lines that amplify the immediate threat of the here and now. This new cycle begins after 9/11 with the rise of so-called torture porn films like Saw, Hostel, Turistas, and its ensuing copycats. As film scholar Aaron Michael Kerner has pointed out, the appearance of torture porn films coincides almost simultaneously with the enhanced interrogation techniques, quote unquote, of the American military under the Bush-Cheney administration. Terrorist abductions and killings of journalists and foreign nationals videotaped and circulated on the web, and revelations of prisoner abuse in Abu Ghraib. In this opposed but complementary relation, scenes from the War on Terror and trailers for torture porn films coexisted across media in such a way that one could be forgiven for confusing life and art as they appear to be telescoping into each other. We'll return to torture porn later. For now, I raise these developments in the genre and the related historical moments to illustrate, as social and political crises shift, so too do the protocols of the horror film. Indeed, horror films often succeed and are distinguished from their peers less on the proficiency of its performers, clever turns of phrase in a script, or elaborately orchestrated jump scares than on their timeliness. That is, the extent to which they are able to implicitly tap into the socio-political mood of their time. Today, we are in a new period of crisis as we navigate a raging global pandemic and fight to mitigate widespread death, to slow the acceleration of hypercapitalism that has further cleaved what was already a yawning chasm between the wealthy and the poor, and to adequately address what has no doubt been the cultural issue in America over the past decade, the central issue in America over the past decade, the problems of racial justice and police barbarity that continue to plague Black American lives. Just as the gruesome visualizations of human demolition in torture porn appeared at a time when scenes of unprecedented violence and torture circulated openly in a viral media sphere, it appears that the terrain of the horror film is again shifting, this time on the subject of race. Jordan Peele's Get Out is by and large responsible for this shift. It is the watershed film in the genre's recent pivot toward race and has almost single-handedly triggered a new wave of American horror films. Horror movies are often said to provide viewers with a safe channel for purging violent impulses by offering a manageable way of dealing with deep-rooted anxieties and fears. But does this hypothesis also hold true for Black viewers of horror films? In her preface to the published script and production notes of Get Out, media scholar Tana Nariv Due suggests that horror movies populated by imaginary monsters and demons are tailor-made for the Black American experience, as they allow Black viewers to vicariously purge the traumas of everyday life through the screen. At face value, this proposition seems tenable. But if the purpose of the horror film is to manufacture fear and frighten audiences with imaginary monsters and link these feelings to the pleasures of aestheticized violence, how do they serve a population whose lives are socially negated, or whose lives are shaped by horrors more immense than any on screen? An example sharpens the point. In the recently released Black horror film His House, the film's protagonist, Rial, sums up this challenge in one powerful line of dialogue. Rial and her husband, Bol, are Sudanese refugees struggling to forget a violent past and trying vigorously to integrate into an impoverished British neighborhood. When Rial tries to convince Bol that a curse has followed them into their new home, Bol dismisses her concerns by telling her it is only in her imagination, to which she replies, quote, "After all we've endured, after what we have seen, what men can do, you think it is bumps in the night that frighten me? You think I can be afraid of ghosts?" Does this rhetoric of the horror film as a safe space for working through negative affects have the same import for Black viewers who have had to steel themselves against things that go bump in the night? Does the horror film offer the same cathartic possibilities for Black viewers as it is said to offer white viewers? These questions remain open, but what we know for certain is the American horror film has historically been unkind to Black characters who tend only to appear in the genre in support of its white protagonists, as comic relief in the form of cooning and buffooning, to offer exaggerated expressions of terror as a comedic pressure valve for the film's rising tensions, or as victims inevitably scheduled for early dismissal by the film's monster. Even in the case of George Romero's groundbreaking 1968 film Night of the Living Dead, its memorable finale sees its Black protagonist executed with a marksman rifle, mistakenly, by a roaming band of white vigilantes, a scene that unintentionally, though grimly, overlapped with the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. that same year. Of all the major film genres, it would seem the horror film is particularly inhospitable to its Black characters and dismissive of Black life in general. So we begin with two cliches. The first, in horror movies, the Black guy always dies first. It is a platitude repeated often enough that it has come to be culturally accepted as a generic norm of the American horror film, even by those who watch very few of them. The truth of the matter is the Black guy doesn't always die first, but it is telling that Black death is readily presumed to inaugurate the monster's murder spree and is a sure indicator of the status accorded Blackness in the genre. The second cliche is Black characters exhibit powers of intuition and common sense in horror films that white characters do not possess. In his 1983 stand-up comedy show Delirious, Eddie Murphy hilariously mocks the divergent responses between white and Black characters to hauntings and potential dangers. After a screening of Poltergeist, Murphy wonders, quote, "Why don't white people just leave the house when there's a ghost in the house? It's very simple. There's a ghost in the house, get the heck out of the house." Heck being my substitute. He continues, "In the Amityville horror, the ghost told them to get out of the house. White people stayed in there. Murphy then imagines himself in the house of the Amityville Horror with his wife admiring its interior design and the children playing outside. He says, "I really like it here. This is really nice." Then playing the ghost, Murphy whispers, "Get out." Then flips back to the husband, "Too bad we can't stay, baby." Coincidentally, or perhaps in direct reference to Murphy's bit, Lamberto Bava's 1985 film Demons has a black man playing a caricature of black masculinity in American blaxploitation cinema, accompanied by two black women arriving at a theater in Berlin for a screening of a zombie film. When one of the women attending the screening with him turns into a demon, the black man yells for all in the theater to hear, quote, "Get out, everybody get away, get out, what are you waiting for, run." Bearing out precisely Murphy's comedic take on white responses to horror movie hauntings, we see black common sense in action. Eclipsing the trope of dying first, the ability to assess the potential risk in a threatening situation and employing common sense in the face of danger stands out as the definitive trait black characters exhibit in horror films. It should not go ignored here that the title of Peele's film explicitly leverages these episodes when black common sense tries to intervene in moments of clear and present danger. Unsurprisingly, black characters share their insights. When black characters share their insights, it typically occurs within the register of humor and functions as comedic relief. This particular stereotype played out in rather spectacular fashion in mid-November of 2017, when the Hollywood Foreign Press announced the nomination of Get Out for a Golden Globe Award in the category of Best Musical or Comedy. The nomination sparked considerable controversy across social media. Much of the backlash hinged on the notion that a largely non-black voting body showed itself incapable of taking seriously the film's depictions of white liberal racism, the abduction, purchase, and enslavement of black bodies, the structural perpetuation of black indentured servitude for profit, and the overt fantasies and fetishizations it mobilizes in the white imaginary. Lil Rel Howery, the actor who plays Rod in the film, addressed the controversy on Twitter with a post that read, quote, "But if I can be honest, this is weird to me. There was nothing funny about racism. Was it that unrealistic? LOL." Jordan Peele, also responding to the matter on Twitter with acuity, added, quote, "Get Out is a documentary." If there was a single point around which outrage coalesced, it was the perceived insensitivity to the black community that a story unambiguously about white supremacy and the clandestine forms it takes under neoliberalism would be deemed a comedy by a long-standing institution like the Hollywood Foreign Press. As Peele observed, the reason for the visceral response to the movie being called a comedy is that we are still living in a time in which African-American cries for justice aren't being taken seriously. As he goes on to say, it's important to acknowledge that though there are funny moments, the systemic racism that the movie is about is very real. The Hollywood Foreign Press has a history of nominating films in categories that seem questionable or erroneous. But I would submit that the film's categorical misplacement and the indeterminacy around its classification has less to do with the structure or narrative of the film, its funny moments as Peele describes, or the question of how best to situate it within available generic categories, and has more to do with the signifying power of blackness. Put differently, it is black protagonism that destabilizes the generic legibility of the film as horror and produces this indeterminacy. Much of this confusion can be attributed to how representations of blackness in Hollywood have historically fused the genres of comedy and horror. It is remarkable that apart from Get Out, the most successful black-cast, black-made horror films have all been parodies of the genre, chief among them the Scary Movie franchise, developed by the Wayans brothers of In Living Color fame, spanning 2000 to 2013. These films draw on both stereotypical portrayals of black characters in horror movies and, more broadly, on racist perceptions of black people in America for much of its humor. For example, in the first Scary Movie, in 2000, a white teenage girl named Drew is killed at a high school, and several news channels arrive to report live from the scene. The camera pans across several reporters standing next to their vans, delivering the news with poise and professionalism before stopping on a reporter from Black TV, who is already sitting in the passenger side of his news van. The black reporter anxiously declares, quote, "Reporting live from black TV, white folks are dead and we're getting the heck out of here." Again, heck is my replacement there. The van speeds away with its panicked black passengers before the doors can close. The scene continues with three girls discussing the possibility of being interviewed on TV when the black girl among them says, quote, "The press only wants to interview the most ignorant person that they can find." Cut immediately to Shorty, played by Marlon Wayans, an overzealous black teenager being interviewed by reporters. The reporter asks, what would you have done, and what would you have said to Drew and with her last words? To which Shorty, not unlike the black man in Bava's Demons, bluntly replies, "Run, bitch, run." In Scary Movie 3 from 2003, Brenda, a black woman, watches the cursed video made famous in the Ring franchise. Before calling out to her white friend in another room, quote, "Cindy, the news is on. Another little white girl has just fell down a well. 50 black people get their ass beat by police today, but the whole world has to stop when one little white girl falls down a well," end quote. In Ezio Grigio's The Silence of the Hams from 1994, a precursor to the horror parody boom of the 2000s, the beating of Rodney King by the Los Angeles Police Department is mockingly restaged, replete with King's infamous plea, "Can't we all just get along?" The humor in these scenes hinges on a reality principle, that a black woman would see an iconic scene from a horror film and mistake it for the news, or that one of the few appearances of black people in an early horror parody would mock amateur video of the Rodney King beating, widely circulated on broadcast news, supports Peele's quip that Get Out is a documentary. In the many interviews Peele gave following the film's release, the question of categorical placement remained an area of contention. While he has steadfastly aligned Get Out with the horror genre and has gone into great detail citing the horror films that influenced the film's plot design and visual language, Peele has also acknowledged the limitations that any single genre affords a text as a categorical marker or as a framework that monolithically determines its meaning. In an interview published in New York Magazine's Vulture section, Peele admits to not knowing which genre best suits Get Out. He admits struggling to, quote, "figure out what genre this movie was," and horror didn't quite do it. Psychological thriller didn't do it. And Peele's solution to the problem, it would seem, was to develop a category that he calls the social thriller. In the social thriller, Peele tells us, quote, "The bad guy is society. These things that are innate in all of us and provide good things but ultimately prove that humans are always going to be barbaric to an extent," end quote. In the introduction to the edited volume, Jordan Peele's Get Out, Political Horror, Dawn Keatley adds a finer point to Peele's description when she writes, quote, "The distinctive terrain of the social thriller is that the monster is intractably human, the demon inextricably part of the very real fabric of society," end quote. Useful as these definitions of the social thriller may be, they raise questions as to the need for an entirely new paradigm or why available generic categories do not appear to adequately describe Get Out. If we understand the social in social thriller in the sense Peele suggests, then social refers to society itself as an irreducibly imperiling force that will inevitably manifest its innermost potential for cruelties upon persons within a given community. But is this not already partially a definition of the modern horror film? In his groundbreaking essay, An Introduction to the American Horror Film, Robin Wood persuasively argues that all horror films express societal fears through culturally specific forms of repression. The locus of cultural repression in American society, Wood tells us, is sexuality. Closely linked to the repression of sexuality is the concept of the other, which as Wood claims, in remarks, though written in the early 80s, aptly describe Get Out, quote, "Bourgeois ideology cannot recognize or accept, but must deal with otherness in one of two ways, either by rejecting and, if possible, annihilating it, or by rendering it safe and assimilating it, converting it as far as possible into a replica of itself," end quote. Thus, repression and the other come together precisely in the domain of the social, and this fact is made apparent in the 8 examples Wood offers. These essentially are examples that constitute otherness in the modern horror film. So we have, of course, other people, women, the proletariat, other cultures, ethnic groups within the culture, alternative ideologies or political systems, deviations from ideological sexual norms, and children. And for any of you who have spent any time watching horror movies, you'll immediately recognize that each of these categories constitutes monstrosity in one way, shape, or form in numerous horror films across the genre. Alone or taken together, the fabric of American society is woven from these threads, and the many iterations of monstrosity in modern American horror films are all products, in one form or another, of society. Therefore, to suggest that the conflation of monstrosity and the social is the distinct terrain of the social thriller is to ignore the intervention Wood's landmark essay makes and its widespread influence on the field of horror studies. If indeed the link between American society and the monstrous has long been the cornerstone of serious discussions of the modern horror film, then the category of the social thriller is a tautology, but no less a curious one. The difficulty Peele expresses in trying to place his film within the coordinates of the horror genre stems not from a lack of familiarity with its patterns for organizing narrative conflicts or its dominant themes and character types, but rather, I would submit, results from him knowing them too well. In other words, Peele's knowledge of the genre produces the very epistemological rupture he satirizes with the quip, quote, "It's a documentary," then later seeks to reconcile through the invention of a new generic category in deciding, quote, "It's a social thriller." All of this brings us back to the signifying power of blackness. When Peele describes his trouble categorizing Get Out, what he's really saying is he's trying to come to terms with how to integrate black protagonism into a genre that has historically excluded black narrative agency, except in the outlier cases of George Romero's Night of the Living Dead, 70s blaxploitation horror films like Blackula and Blackenstein, or art house anomalies like Bill Gunn's Ganja and Hess, and what seems to me its remake, Claire Denis' Trouble Every Day. Far from being merely a derivative turn or satirical portrayal of blackness, what horror films from blaxploitation cinema to the horror parodies of the late 90s and early 2000s register is how blackness in the cultural imaginary is generically comprehensible only within inflexible and highly restricted narrative positions. This much discussed and generalized confusion over how to categorize Get Out is unmistakably fused to the blackness of the film's protagonist. It is so unusual and unexpected to see a black man as a lead character in a horror film that is not explicitly a satire or a comedy that when the trailer for the film was first released, the unusual narrative proposition it offered caused many, myself included, to immediately take notice. The theatrical trailer for Get Out was released on October 4th of 2016. As we know, it begins with a young black man opening the door to his apartment and kissing his white girlfriend who has come to pick him up for a weekend visit to her parents' home in the suburbs. The image of a young interracial couple in a Hollywood film would be cause enough for arrest as it comes freighted with a deep history of racist representations dating back to the emergence of Hollywood narrative cinema itself. But that the trailer appeared to be advertising a horror film with a black lead was equally, if not more, stunning. Describing her own astonishment at seeing the film's trailer, Tananarive Due writes, quote, "In the fall of 2016, I sat mouth agape watching the trailer for an upcoming horror film called Get Out. It had a black protagonist, was addressing race in ways both obvious and subtle, and it showed a black child sinking through his bed and into the floor into what I would later learn was a quietly revolutionary concept called the sunken place." In reactions on social media forums, one could gauge a common feeling that the trailer was promoting something out of the ordinary. On the black popular culture video site worldstarhiphop.com, responding to the trailer, one commenter declares, quote, "Finally, a horror movie with an African-American lead." Another writes, quote, "What if the black man doesn't even survive this one, though?" Several comments also underscore the problem of genre. Quote, "Watch the trailer the first time, it looks like a horror movie. Watch again, and it's a comedy." Similarly, one commenter asks, "So is this a black comedy or what?" To which another commenter replies definitively, "Black horror." And finally, another comment reads, well, 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 if this brother ain't smart enough to see the signs and listen to his partners, then he deserves what he gets. Plus, you already know he's not going to make it out of that compound. Dead man walking, end quote. Most of the comments, 2,536 when last I checked, responding to the film's trailer, all share this tone of surprise, confusion, and certainty in how the film will inevitably end for its black lead. In sum, Blackness elevated to the role of lead protagonist, even in the fragment of a movie trailer, in a horror film, does not simply subvert audience expectations or disrupt the rituals of viewership and participation the genre mandates, it short-circuits the paradigm altogether. Black horror parodies notwithstanding, when a black protagonist is dying, dies, or is undead, black agency can logically be assimilated into the generic economy of the American horror film. Alternatively, a black protagonist surviving the monster's onslaught and living until the final image fades and the credits roll is so unprecedented, even Peele himself cannot come to terms with the narrative proposition his own film affords. Little wonder then why a horror film with a black protagonist, black characters, and a few fleeting moments of humor would reflexively be deemed a comedy even by its prospective audience after seeing only a promotional trailer. From the Scary Movie cycle and its lesser Wayans Brothers helmed spin-off A Haunted House in 2013 and A Haunted House 2 in 2014, from Leprechaun in the Hood in 2000 and Leprechaun Back to the Hood in 2003, to Tyler Perry's Boo! A Medea Halloween in 2016 and Boo! 2 in 2017, the tone of black contributions to the genre has historically not been one of seriousness or legitimacy, but rather parody and self-deprecation. Subverting parodic expectations of blackness in Hollywood horror films is Get Out's first masterstroke, and the categorical confusion around the film attests to how deeply representations of blackness in the genre remain bonded to narrative protocols of folly and buffoonery. It will come as little surprise that the generic illegibility of black protagonism in horror is deeply entangled with histories of anti-black racism in Hollywood. The various confusions Get Out inspires around race and categorical placement throws light on the structural exclusion of blacks from playing certain character types and genres that have traditionally been reserved for white actors portraying white characters. Admittedly, the subject of systemic racism in Hollywood and tracking its obdurate arc goes well beyond what can be adequately addressed here, but it is important to note that Get Out's release coincides with the social justice siren calls of the hashtags Time's Up and Oscars So White, both respectively advocating for gender and racial parity in the film industry. Efforts to diversify all areas of the Hollywood film industry serve as the backdrop to Jordan Peele's feature directorial debut, with a film about a black man who endures every imaginable form of liberal racism en route to indefinite physical and psychic bondage. Curiously, though, over the course of these wide-ranging debates on genre and classification, what has passed largely without comment, even from its writer-director, is the film's close affiliation in tone and structure to one subgenre in particular, the torture porn film. In his book, Torture Porn in the Wake of 9/11, Horror, Exploitation in the Cinema of Sensation, film scholar Aaron Michael Kerner identifies the key tropes that define torture porn. In his study of the torture porn film, here are some of the tropes that Kerner identifies. Torture porn films are always based in reality, and as I go through these, note just off of the description of these tropes how readily they lend themselves to a description of Get Out. Torture porn films are always based in reality. Horror is not an external phenomenon, it is more intimately a part of us and caused by us. As he puts it, torture porn, perhaps more than any other incarnation of the horror genre before it, starkly vivifies this idea. 2, victims are abducted before they are tortured or killed. 3, domestic homes double as torture facilities. 4, victims struck by the randomness and inexplicability of their abduction and the violence they are subjected to ask questions like, why are you doing this? What did I ever do to you? Victims are rebirthed from the womb of the torture chamber after they escape. Torture porn narratives are structured around gaming motifs and big game hunting. Abductors use video to moralize their violence. Flashbacks offering background information on abductors and/or victims tend also to be mediated through video. Torture porn films allow spectators to feel the weight of history. Camera flashes are a common trope in torture porn films, typically serving as an editing device. And the intentions of violators are never purely evil in the religious sense of the word. They can always be explained through their moral imperatives or capitalist pursuits. It seems to me not coincidental that the blueprint for the torture porn film, mapped out through the tropes Kerner identifies, lends itself readily to Get Out, a film about neo-slavery and social death in which black bodies are stolen, sold, and stripped of their subjectivity. At its core, torture porn shows how human beings are rendered superfluous in a machinery of unchecked bourgeois curiosity with its inexhaustible fixation on mastering the intractability of life and death. It makes clear how the destruction of human uniqueness, an event that torture in all its permutations does not bring about contingently but one it resolutely pursues, turns bodies into commodities that are expendable not only physically but ontologically as well. The commodification of bodies is in fact so essential to torture porn narratives, it constitutes its guiding imperative. In the Hostel series from 2005 to 2011, young tourists in European cities are abducted and auctioned off to bidders vying for the opportunity to maim, mutilate, and murder their winnings. Similarly, Turistas in 2006 tells the story of backpackers vacationing in a rural region of Brazil before they are abducted by criminals who harvest their organs and sell them on the black market. In Pascal Logier's underappreciated 2008 film Martyrs, which, by the way, I think is probably the best horror film made in the last 2 decades, women are captured, tortured, and pushed to the brink of death with the hope that they will enter the liminal space between living and dying and share their transcendental findings with the wealthy patrons funding this macabre undertaking. As recently as the summer of 2021, in Don't Breathe 2, drug dealers conspire to kidnap a teenage girl and surgically remove her heart so that it can be transplanted into her estranged, dying mother whose skill as a narcotic cook is crucial to the success of their illicit business. In these films, and many more like them, the abduction of bodies to be shredded, dismembered, and flayed for purposes of pleasure or profit is frequently linked to a shadow economy where crime and privilege are indistinguishable along the path of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In sum, an individual or organization always profits or attempts to profit in some way from the corporeal disintegration of others. Put plainly, the conventional torture porn narrative would not make sense, nor would its conflicts or the means and ends of its violence be tenable outside the context of neoliberal capitalism and consumerist excess. We see this in the ways these films foreground the desires that fuel capitalist consumption and how they invariably lead to feelings of dissatisfaction that paradoxically appear resolvable only through further accumulation and consumption at the expense of others, and even more radically, oneself. Naturally, Get Out extends this logic of capitalism in the allusions it makes to the transatlantic slave trade and how it portrays black bodies as fungible commodities. Thus, on the question of genre, the torture porn film would appear to be tailor-made for a story about the perpetuation of black indentured servitude through the capture, sale, and surgical manipulation of black bodies made into psychic vessels for wealthy white people. By adding blackness and subtracting torture, and utilizing not some but all its tropes, Get Out marks both a watershed in the history of black horror and offers a unique variation on the torture porn film that modifies the paradigm in significant ways. I raise the conventions of torture porn in relation to Get Out not to try to resolve the tension around its generic categorization. I do not believe that this is a tension easily resolved by decidedly declaring it as torture porn. However, even in the absence of graphic scenes of bodily undoing common in torture porn films, it should be clear that its core themes and plot devices show it to be patently one of them. The point I wish to emphasize is that black protagonism in the horror film appears to shift otherwise recognizable conventions into a critical blind spot. From horror to comedy, from social thriller to torture porn, the generic elasticity of Get Out proves amenable to a wide swath of Hollywood genres, and this phenomenon, I maintain, is directly attributable to the destabilizing effect of the final brother and black survival. In their most basic sense, all horror films are about survival. In Wes Craven's postmodern classic Scream, one of the characters, our friend here, who you may recognize for those of you who've seen Scream, explains to a house full of friends that there are rules for successfully surviving a horror film. Note, of course, that as he's explaining how to survive a horror film, everyone at the party is white. And this, of course, would be the case because sharing the rules for surviving a horror film with a black character would be as futile as explaining to a burrito why you're eating it. As he describes it, 1, you can never have sex. Sex equals death. 2, you can't drink or do drugs. It's a sin. It's an extension of number 2. And 3, never ever say you'll be right back because you won't be back. Needless to say, this character leaves out an important 4th rule, that you must be white. If you are black, you can be certain that your death is coded into the narrative arc of the film. Black death is itself a convention of the horror film. With that said, there is one generic convention that has come to define character development and paradigms of survival in horror. And it is what film scholar Carol Clover has famously dubbed the final girl. In her book, Men, Women, and Chainsaws, Gender in the Modern Horror Film, Clover identifies an archetypal shift where women who traditionally function as objects to be looked at or as victims in need of saving by a male protagonist undergo a role reversal. What Clover discovers is that a female protagonist, a final girl, tends not only to be the last survivor of the modern horror film, she's the film's guiding agential force in defeating and destroying the monster, or at least temporarily suspending the monster's murderous rampage until the inevitable sequel. There are several recurring characteristics that identify the final girl and distinguish her from others in her group. Unsurprisingly, these characteristics dovetail with the basic requirements for surviving a horror movie as described by the horror cinephile in Scream. She tends to be morally centered, is often portrayed as virginal, and avoids or shows restraint from partaking in illicit pleasures, such as drugs and drinking, activities that mark others for death, proves to be preternaturally resourceful, is portrayed as having masculine qualities in name, dress, comportment, and is the one who ultimately destroys the monster or sets up the monster's elimination via institutional forces. According to Clover, the final girl signals a dramatic departure from the typically gendered divisions between heroes and victims in horror movies, and the identificatory attachments formed between the genre's predominantly male audience and its male protagonists. She permits fluid forms of identification across gender lines, as male spectators can align their gaze with a female protagonist through her desexualization, physical strength, and her capacities for problem solving. While Clover's concept of the final girl identifies an important trend that overturns fixed notions of survivability in the horror genre, there are some narrative elements that remain consistent despite this blurring of protagonist gender lines. All horror films are essentially narratives in which normality is threatened by the monster. Horror films of the classical period, roughly 1921 to mid-1960s, during this period, the destruction of the monster and the restitution of normality are achieved almost invariably through the intervention of social institutions, police, church, military, medicine, whose primary focus is to preserve the safety and sanctity of the heterosexual monogamous couple and or the nuclear family, or simply normality, as it were. In the horror films of the modern period, we're thinking roughly mid-1960s, people usually take Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho as kind of like the marking point, the beginning point of the modern horror film, until roughly the early 1990s. In horror films of the modern period, normality and the monster are intertwined. The monster threatening normality is not a foreign entity or other, but comes from within the very normality being threatened. Cops become maniac cops. Doctors try to bridge the gap between life and death. Priests lose their faith or court and conjure demonic spirits. Brothers, mothers, and fathers are all potential killers. The final girl becomes a dominant trope in the horror film at precisely the moment when the genre, as Robin Wood puts it, becomes deeply incoherent. The long-standing Hays Code rule that all monsters must die at the end of horror films is deregulated. Institutional forces are no longer effective in stopping the monster. Patriarchal figures are rendered useless or traitorous, and endings are left open-ended and unresolved. Though the modern period of the horror film is marked by a lack of resolution, as the monsters in these films are rarely, if ever, decisively destroyed, going back to Wood's basic formula is crucial to an understanding of race in American horror films and what makes Chris Washington, as the prototype of the final brother, such a unique protagonist. Normality in every sense of the word refers to worlds of white privilege, and the final girl is tasked not only with destroying the monster, but coded in her survival is the very possibility that normality could and should be restored. This encoding of normality occurs in and through the final girl's whiteness. If we add a touch of specificity to Clover's formula, the final girl is almost invariably the final white girl. Some of the more notable examples of this character type include Mary Collingwood, Last House on the Left, 1972, Jess Bradford, Black Christmas, 1974, Sally Hardesty, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974, Laurie Strode, Halloween, 1978, Nancy Thompson, A Nightmare on Elm Street, and Sidney Prescott, Scream, all white women. The monster's threat to normality presumes that there is a normality to be threatened. Conflicts between monster and institution of the classical variation are ultimately all conflicts in which a protagonist seeks to restore normality and return to a world as it was prior to the monster's arrival. But what happens when there is no normality to begin with, or no normality to fight for or attempt to restore? What happens if there is not a time before the monster's arrival? One of the constitutive elements of narrative is that all sentient beings can experience redemption. But as Frank B. Wilderson III points out in his book Afro-Pessimism, if, quote, history and redemption are the weave of narrative, as provocative as it may sound, history and redemption, and therefore narrative itself, are inherently anti-black, end quote. It is worth repeating here Wilderson's observation that, quote, blackness is social death, which is to say that there was never a prior moment of plenitude, never a moment of equilibrium, never a moment of social life, which is to say never a moment of, quote, normality. This reworking of the horror film's basic formula in the context of blackness offers, I think, an effective framework for understanding the narrative of Get Out, its points of contact with and departure from other American horror films before it, and the dilemmas facing Chris as the prototype of the final brother. The final brother is a character type that is by necessity more speculative than empirical, for unlike Clover, I do not have a cross-section of examples to map out a decades-long tendency. But I want to suggest that the lack of examples from which to draw comparisons is not a shortcoming, but rather signals its importance and underscores the urgency to develop a working model. While it is true that seeing a morally centered, vice-avoiding, white virginal heroine survive a horror film narrative proved to be a significant development in the genre in the early 1970s and beyond, to see a lone black protagonist survive the monster and try to restore normality, even today, is a sight that is nothing short of astonishing. In other words, because there are few, if any, films with which to compare and thus chart patterns of development for lone black survivors, using the paradigm of the final girl as a framework for thinking race in the horror genre opens up new and productive areas of inquiry. Drawing on the character of Chris Washington and the circumstances in which we find him, I want to offer a preliminary sketch of the final brother to show how strikingly divergent, in fact, how completely inverted, the conditions of survivability are for a lone black survivor and a lone white woman in a horror movie. I offer a chart of basic oppositions. As you can see here, for those of you who are familiar with The Final Girl as a paradigm of protagonism in the horror genre, and as we've discussed, you'll immediately recognize that, of course, the final girl is always a white woman, that her presence in the narrative signifies the possibility of a return to normality, right? Of a return to the point before the monster's arrival. As Clover points out, the final girl is the subject of the white gaze, meaning that she allows for, as noted in the second point, the point right after, that she allows for cross-gender identification. That is, that male spectators in the audience are able to align their gaze or align their perspective with the heroism of the final girl. Of course, she has to be virginal, and she uses her intuition to survive. As we see with the final brother, if we think about what happens to Chris Washington throughout that film, of course, in contrast, he is a black man. His presence in the narrative signifies the impossibility of a return to normality. This is the central premise for those of you who may have come across the term Afro-pessimism, the idea that there is no point to which one being black in America and having to live in the wake of the transatlantic slave trade, that there is no point of normality to which one might return. So in a sense, because the film itself is in many ways a kind of metaphor for the transatlantic slave trade, it itself signifies the sense of an impossibility of a return to normality. He is the object of the white gaze, which is to say that he is a commodity. It doesn't allow for the type of, the possibility of aligning our gaze with his perspective, because he is taken to be an object of curiosity, an object to be looked over and to potentially be acquired and consumed. Cross-racial identification is impossible. This is an interesting one. Note in the beginning of Get Out, when Chris is in the bathroom and he is applying shaving cream to his face, there is a point in the beginning of the film when as he's in the bathroom, the scene is cross-cut with Rose at the bakery scanning through the pastries and looking at which pastries she's going to buy and she's going to acquire. Peele strategically cross-cuts these scenes with Rose looking at the pastries while Chris is in the mirror applying the shaving cream. In a sense, him applying this white shaving cream as he prepares to go on this trip with Rose to see her parents is in a sense a kind of whiting up, right? And notice that as he's removing the shaving cream, removing this kind of white mask that he's applied to his face, that he nicks himself, he cuts himself. So precisely at the moment when he's removing this mask, in essence, he cuts himself and there's like a moment of pain. I want to suggest that what this scene implies is that at the moment when one tries to have this kind of moment of cross-racial identification, it is always accompanied with pain. It's not this kind of smooth sort of racial cross-identification that the white patrons who are trying to buy Chris's body can seamlessly just integrate into those bodies, right? Narrative social death is integral, which again is an extension of this idea that the return to normality is not possible. The fact that Chris is raped is also, I think, an interesting one. When you stop and think about it, his relationship with Rose, their sexual relation, his consent has essentially been abrogated by the structure of the sexual encounter itself, which is to say that because he doesn't realize that what's being committed against him is an act of aggression, he hasn't had an opportunity to actually consent to the sex as such. So in essence, what is actually happening every time he's having sex with Rose amounts to a rape. And of course, he ignores his intuition to sustain white comfort, which is something that I would like to turn to right now. And so I want to circle back to the subject of intuition and recall how Rod jokingly reminds Chris of the potential danger he's putting himself in by traveling to the suburbs to visit Rose's family. As events at the Armitage estate unfold and Chris shares with Rod some of the strange incidents that have occurred, he implores Chris to cut his visit short and return to the city immediately. The comedic tone of Rod's warning and intuitions are a piece with the standard generic responses of black characters in horror movies. These clarion calls of black survival are rarely, if ever, taken seriously and typically function as little more than speed bumps along the route to the inevitable dismissal of black characters from the film. This is frequently the case in story arcs where white protagonists are the only legitimate contenders for survival against the monster that seeks to eliminate them. Rod asks, "How are you not scared of this, bruh?" The moment plays for comedic effect, as Rod's role in the film is to proffer levity and provide the humor necessary to balance the gravity of the story. Chris, ignoring Rod's warnings, on one hand, calls into question his status as a woke black character. And there are reasons to explain away the signs Rod tries to call to Chris's attention, but one reason in particular seems most compelling. Some critics have suggested that if Chris is woke, he should be capable of recognizing that he is in a horror movie narrative, which is to say that he's in full command of his powers of intuition, and that all of the microaggressions and subtle racist remarks he's had to endure lend evidence to forms of black social marginalization that he should be aware of and actively push back against. Alternatively, I believe Chris clearly recognizes the situation that he's in. Chris does not read the signs the way Rod interprets them, not because he lacks intuition or common sense, or the common sense that Rod possesses, qualities, again, that are conventional to black characters in horror films, but because he does not want to see the signs as such. To recognize the signs as they appear to him, all of which signal that he is in a situation that he should extricate himself from, is also to enter into the admission that he does not belong in Rose's world. Chris had already expressed this feeling to Rose back in his apartment before driving with Rose to her parents' house with the question, "Do they know I'm black?" before being ushered unawares to the property on which he is scheduled to be auctioned. Stated in the affirmative, another way of expressing the undercurrent of this feeling would be to confess, "I don't belong in your world, but I hope to." This sentiment is common in Hollywood melodramas, where class difference operates as an impediment to the union of the heterosexual couple. For example, in Gus Van Sant's Good Will Hunting from 1997, Skylar asks Will to join her in California, and after a brief disagreement, Will's response accelerates quickly into emotional eruption, culminating in what amounts to the admission, "I don't belong in your world." Statements of this kind are rarely heard in race films. The reason for this might have something to do with the ontological magnitude of what is implied. In a sense, for black characters in a Hollywood film to admit, "I do not belong in your world," is also to declare that they do not belong to any world at all. Will Hunting can express this feeling, for even in the context of an enormous class division, he still remains squarely positioned in a world of white privilege. No such luck for Chris. Contrary to the evidence before him, Chris hopes that he will be accepted and that everything that he already knows about the dramas of black and white in America that are contained in the question, "Do they know I'm black?" will be bracketed away into exception. This is what makes Chris's story so profoundly sad. For it is his trauma that guides his thinking and his decision-making. His is a life world of melancholy and abandonment, of deep forgotten wells of guilt and regret. It suffuses even his photographs. "So brutal, so melancholic," says Jim the art dealer. Put plainly, there is no precedent for a character like Chris in the history of American horror films. Chris plays against black character typology not out of ignorance or a banal reversal of generic codes. Chris is clearly aware that things around him are not adding up. His cell phone is unplugged and left uncharged. He is hypnotized against his will, but wakes up skeptical if it is a dream or reality. The black groundskeepers behave oddly. A black guest at the Armitage party who looks familiar to Chris erupts into pleas for Chris to get out. Yet he knowingly and willingly pushes these incidents aside and chooses wishful thinking as he proceeds through the film's story arc. Chris's failure to act on those capacities for common sense, intuition, and threat recognition reveal a deep paradox at the center of black character typology. While it is true that black characters frequently are able to recognize threats and the conditions of bodily peril they are in, they are almost never able to capitalize on this ability to the ends of their own survival. At best, this skill serves two predominant functions. First, to aid in the survival of the white characters who lack this skill but directly benefit from it, which rather spectacularly reinforces the cultural superstructures of white supremacy's theft of black ability. And the second, to provide comic relief and facilitate the periods of relaxation necessary for the efficacy of the genre's spikes of intensity during confrontations between monster and victim. This paradox signals, I think, a deep-seated logic by which Black intuition surrenders its deductions to the promise, one is all too aware, white worlds hold out to white inhabitants. This is the horror film's version of the familiar rhetorical formulation, I know very well, but. One of the assurances held forth by a white world to white inhabitants is that ontological integrity is a birthright, and even when safety and security is imperiled, in the end, to quote Bob Marley, a beloved and well-trafficked white conduit into Black culture, everything's going to be all right. It is fruitful here to note that privilege reinforces the inherent presumptions of safety and security that ultimately imperil white characters in horror films. For example, of course going into the basement is fine. Why wouldn't it be? The Evil Dead. Of course going into the attic is fine. Why wouldn't it be? The Exorcist. Of course going into the woods is fine. Why wouldn't it be? The Blair Witch Project. Of course being white and going into a besieged Black urban neighborhood is fine. Why wouldn't it be? Candyman. This list could continue ad infinitum. One of the most powerful ruses of living Black life in a neoliberal white world is that it is possible for Black existence to safely operate under the same phantasmatic protections that shield white characters. The long modernity of the American horror film capitalizes on these protections in spaces like the family home, the summer camp, on camping expeditions, cave explorations, backpacking trips in foreign countries, diving expeditions, and other areas and activities populated by the leisure class. Because white characters see these spaces as inherently safe spaces, when they are threatened by the other or become sites of annihilation and undoing, the sense of violation is all the more immense. The paradox, therefore, is that while Black characters in horror films invariably fall somewhere on the intuitional spectrum between divine foresight and common sense, and can, as it were, read the writing on the wall and identify the potential threats imperiling them and those around them, they function only as oracles for white protagonists or prove powerless in capitalizing on their own intuitive and epistemological advantages. And this is what makes Chris's abduction all the more tragic. Chris, against every impulse and in flagrant denial of Rod's warnings and his own intuitions, wants to believe that he's mistaken. Chris wants to believe Rose wants him and that every microaggression he experiences, every act of muted racism, all the moments when his Blackness and his Black body and its potential are foregrounded at the expense of his subjectivity, are all reducible to simply how it is and what it means to move through a world that has fundamentally marked him as other. There is an argument to be made that of all the Black characters in the whole history of American horror films, Chris was provided with more cues to the danger he was in and more signals alerting him to that danger than any other Black character in any other horror film before him. To wit, Andre literally grabs Chris and screams, "Get out." But moments later, we find Chris in a room among the Armitage family's guests as Logan, having pushed Andre back into the sunken place with the aid of Missy, explains away the incident. And so, in the end, Get Out poses some rather difficult questions. How is it that so many Black bodies have disappeared without repercussion? What can we learn about the vulnerability of Black life in the present from the manner and method Black bodies are captured and cast into New World slavery to a colonizing white consciousness in the coagula procedure? What happens when we are made acutely aware that systems of power and wealth in America anticipate Black death and have in place mechanisms to profit from the subjugation and fungibility of Black bodies? How can Black life be lived in the face of this material fact and the impact of its full realization? One of the questions the film poses is how will Chris be left to live his life in the aftermath of his attempted abduction? How does this young Black man now navigate a world he knows sees him as a fungible commodity, his body something upon which claims can be made and possessions seized? What does Chris do with the knowledge that, as race scholar Christina Sharp concludes, this is Black life in the wake? This is the flesh. These are the bodies to which anything and everything can be done. Finally, where does the final brother go? The tagline for Tobe Hooper's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is, "Who will survive and what will be left of them?" This line, in its simplicity, has remained the genre's definitive question. But in race horror films, few that they are, the possible responses available for the conditions of survivability appear to be in direct opposition. Get Out's alternate ending, where we see Chris arrested and incarcerated for the events at the Armitage estate, offers a glimpse into another possibility, the one all too common in everyday Black life. However, the ending Peele landed on, the theatrical ending, the one he devised in its place, is everywhere more sophisticated, more complex, and more nuanced. Not for the obvious reasons of mood and tone in telling the story. To see Chris in a prison jumpsuit puts a heavy pall of somberness over the movie, which is saying quite a bit. But because it raises a more difficult question. How will Chris continue to live in Black America now? This, in a sense, is the more difficult ending. What the ending of Get Out leaves us with is a broken Black man who is forever changed in an America that remains unchanged. In the ending of the film's theatrical release, without having to see Chris surrender to a lifetime of wrongful imprisonment, there is no mistaking that Black trauma will endure, that systems of white supremacy remain, and the auction attendees have returned to their manicured suburban neighborhoods, like the one from the film's opening sequence where Andre is abducted. They will wake up to a new day that is just the same for them as it was before. We are familiar with the story of the arrest and imprisonment of Black men and how Black bodies get caught up in the gears of the prison industrial complex. The more difficult story to tell is Black trauma in perpetuity. Chris is living in the wake of his mother's death, in the wake of transatlantic slavery, in the wake of Jim Crow, in the wake of the Obama presidency, and the fata morgana of post-racial unity it conjured, and in the wake of countless acts of state-sanctioned police brutality and murder against Black people that have reinvigorated social justice movements across the country. By the film's end, he will now have to live in the wake of another shattering trauma and to process not only the delinking of an attachment to another loved one in death, but his fundamental delinking from the world as he knows it. In the last analysis, though the film begins with the Childish Gambino song Redbone and its pleas in its refrain to stay woke, it could very well have ended with the repeated declarations that resonate throughout a different, though equally resonant, Childish Gambino song, "This is America." Thank you. Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you for that talk. So amazing. So, I mean, I've seen this film and taught this film, and you just really opened up so many things that I had thought about. In particular, this sort of like hiding in plain sight use of the torture porn genre. So really great. One thing that I was just hoping that you could expand on a little bit, because I was really interested. So in your checklist of the characteristics of the final brother, you said that cross-racial identification is impossible. And one thing that, and I thought your reading of that through the shaving scenes was so good. You also mentioned like for the spectator, and so I was kind of wondering if you could open up the final brother versus the final girl and that cross-gender identification or the impossibility of cross-racial identification in terms of the spectatorship, because I'd really love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks so much for that. So in drawing a contrast between the final girl and the final brother on those grounds, for those of you who may be familiar with the concept of the final girl, the idea behind the final girl ultimately is that typically when you see a female character in a Hollywood film, the idea ultimately is that the spectator, that is always presumed male spectator, is not able to actually identify with the female characters in the film. As this typically runs in film theory, women in Hollywood films tend to be objects to be looked at. or people in need of saving. Oftentimes they don't have narrative agency, right? What the horror film does, and what the trope of the final girl does, is it actually turns this concept on its head. It says that, well, in fact, the final girl ends up being the kind of lead protagonist, is the guiding agential force in the film, and because of that, in terms of aligning our own gaze, and creating a kind of identificatory connection, identifying the protagonist on screen, the presumed male spectator is actually able to align their gaze with a female character, right? So what we see here is that this idea that Clover argues is that cross-gender identification is possible in this case. Cross-racial identification is not possible in the case of Chris Washington, ultimately because his role in the narrative is not one in terms of actually aligning his gaze with that of the spectator, because he is always an object to be consumed. He is a commodity. He doesn't provide this kind of conduit through which we can actually see what's happening in the narrative world, right? What he actually functions as is ultimately an object that is being looked over, examined, as we see in the party scene, right? So that is essentially the way in which I'm trying to set up that contrast, is that he doesn't function in the narrative, though he is the protagonist of the film. He doesn't offer this kind of, this conduit for the kind of identification that Clover argues for in her concept of the final girl. I want to hear from some students. Has anyone seen Get Out? Do you have any fans of Get Out? Any like real fans of Get Out? Yeah? So here's a question I have for you guys that might stimulate maybe a couple questions or maybe some conversation. One of the questions that I asked, I teach a class on an American horror film, and I show Get Out. And one of the questions that I often ask is, do you think Get Out has a happy ending? Do you think that it ends in a way that, you know, works out well for Chris, that this is a really kind of happy resolution to the film? And most people say yes. The editor's like, yeah, this is a happy ending. Which I find interesting, because again, as I sort of pointed out at the end of my talk, if you really stop and think of it, it's a really, really sad, depressing ending. So I wonder if my reading of the film has made anyone rethink what they perceive to be a happy ending with Get Out. Or if there's anyone who actually still, despite what I've argued, thinks that the film ends up in a kind of happy sort of resolution for Chris. Yeah.
I don't really understand how somebody would think that's necessarily a happy ending. Because I think a big part of the movie, especially like Rod's character, is that like there's no way for Rod or Chris to prove what happened to him. And so when he finally escapes, sort of has to kill the opportunities and get a little bit of satisfaction out of killing the opportunities as well. There's also there's kind of a realization of the mind of the audience and the mind of Chris that like he's never going to be able to overcome that. He's never going to be able to prove what happened down there, because like he's going to sound crazy to people.
Right.
He tries to explain it, and I feel like that's kind of shadowing everything in the film. Even though he escapes, it's like he's not like to be able to recover.
Absolutely, yeah, and I completely agree with your reading. I mean, in a way, when you stop and think about it, one can only presume that eventually the authorities will catch up with Chris. What's taking place at the Armitage compound will be discovered, and that though the alternate ending has him incarcerated in a jumpsuit, and this ending doesn't, the theatrical release ending doesn't, you can almost presume that he's going to end up in prison anyways.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, it's a really kind of shattering ending, even though it tries to offer this kind of moment of humor when Rod is like, consider the situation, fucking handle it. And it's like, it's funny, it tries to add a bit of levity to it, but in reality what we're left with is Chris will probably end up serving the rest of his life in prison. So yeah, I agree with you. I've always found it a little strange when people think that the ending is uplifting. Yeah.
Do you think that the reason people seem to do this with happy ending is more that they're using the idea of a sad ending with a tragic ending? Like, since the main protagonist walks away from the situation alive, that just kind of automatically makes you think, oh, happy ending, because there's like life continues, life goes on, and there's at least a chance to start to recover, there's the opportunity that life presents you to move on, but not really thinking about what that means. Like moving forward, like what would success look like? What would the future hold? Can you predict what would happen? Like you mentioned before, that even though we have the separate ending where he doesn't live in the jumpsuit, we can still go up with the assumption that eventually the events will catch up with him. Like, do you think that there's like kind of a misunderstood view of what a sad ending actually is?
You know, so that's a fantastic question. And in a sense, doesn't your question kind of dovetail with the argument that I'm making about the generic illegibility? How when you introduce Blackness into a recognizable genre, that what it does is that, in a sense, it starts to push recognizable generic tropes into a critical blind spot. And so in some sense, there's an ending that we expect. So with horror, you expect that someone is going to survive, and even in different subgenres of the horror genre, whether it's a slasher film or torture film or what have you, that there will be this kind of resolution where there's a sense of relief, right? And with that relief comes some sense of like, well, this is kind of an uplifting sort of situation because the person survived, right? So precisely to your point, I think that yes, there is a bit of confusion around maybe this kind of understanding of what constitutes maybe a tragic ending and a sad ending, and trying to maybe measure that against our own expectation of how we think a film like this should end. And I think part of the argument that I want to make is that when we have black protagonism in a recognizable genre like the horror film, that it starts to kind of short circuit and transform some of these recognizable conventions that we've become familiar with. And one of the things for us as critics in studying analysis of text is that what we want to try to do is recognize these moments when these recognizable conventions start to become short-circuited, when you introduce questions around like gender, race, and other sort of minoritarian positions. So absolutely, I do think that there is some confusion around that. It has to do, I think, with, again, this kind of idea of black protagonism, at least in this case, with black protagonism, seeing a black character in a position that you wouldn't normally see him or her in. Yeah.
So do you think that the alternate ending is more of a happy ending than the one that was there? Because if we know that either way he's going to be, or we can assume that either way he's going to be incarcerated, he has that line where he says it's over. You know, when he's getting talked to, saying we can get like, you know, a prosecutor involved, we can try to figure this out, and he goes, nope, it's over, I took care of it. Like, and in that it feels more resolved, because like, you know, as they're driving away and you see that look on his face, you know that is kind of just beginning, right? He's had this new trauma that's just entered his life, and if you've ever gone through anything like that, you know, it doesn't end right there. You know, you can't just drive away from it. So I was kind of wondering if you thought maybe the alternate ending was more, because we're seeing what we expected, but it seems like he's more resolved in that than he is in the other one.
So that's a really interesting question. And I think that in the alternate ending, where he says, you know, look, this is done, I don't want any help. Rod is like, come on, man, you gotta remember something. And he's like, I don't want to remember anything. I stopped it. And then he puts the phone down and walks away. My problem with that ending is that throughout Get Out, Chris remains, he's constantly saying the words, it's fine, it's okay, it's fine, it's okay. And these are words that black people oftentimes have to make recourse to in order to preserve the comfort of others that they are in the presence of. It's fine, no, don't worry about it, it's okay. And even Rose is like, how can you take all of this? And he's like, it's fine, it's fine. That ending, to me, extends that sense of being pliant, that sense of just being like, it's fine, it's okay. And that, for me, I think makes that particular ending all the more tragic. Is that at no point, even though Chris does fight back, it's an absolutely futile fight, right? In a sense, at least, with the ending that is in the theatrical ending, as he's driving away and things are just beginning, there is hope. And in the current socio-political climate in which the film emerges, one might imagine that as Chris will probably face the kind of legal ramifications of what happened on that weekend, that there will be a community that comes to his support, right? That there will be some sort of banners one can imagine of like people protesting on his behalf, et cetera, et cetera. So I think at least in that sense, there is this kind of horizon of some type of hope, whatever way in which you want to understand that word. But in the alternate ending, it just seems to me extend precisely this kind of playing attitude that he had been exhibiting throughout the entire film. So in that sense, it stays, I think, pretty consistent to the character typology that Peele constructs in his script for Chris Washington. But I find that to be really, really tragic. So I do think that the ending that we do see in the theatrical ending, in the theatrical release, is, I guess, the better ending, I guess, and in an ending that's not really that great. But of the two, I would probably take that, because at the very least, there is the glimmer of hope.
Right, and I think folks have 110 classes, so we should release them. But thank you so much. This is really